war reporting. You'd think it'd be simple, right? Like just the facts, man.
I'm not quite.
But it gets really complicated, especially somewhere like Israel.
Yeah, it's like reporting on a hurricane from the eye of the storm. You've got this intense national identity. The whole idea of survival just kind of seeps into everything.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're to be diving into.
Mm.
We got this blog post from the Times of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
written by Shira Tamir. She's a student, but she asked some really, really interesting questions about how Israeli media has been covering the recent Gaza war.
Yeah, and she really digs into this idea of Israeli journalists walking this tightrope. On the one hand, they're expected to be patriotic, present this united front to the world. But on the other, they have this duty to report objectively, even when it's uncomfortable.
And she even uses that Hebrew term hasbara to describe it.
Right, right. And it's not just about wartime reporting either. It's deeply rooted in this idea of public diplomacy, shaping global perceptions of Israel.
Yeah.
Think about it. It's in their tourism campaigns, it's in their cultural outreach. It's this whole multi-layered effort to control the narrative.
And when you think about it like that, I mean, it makes sense. They're a nation that's constantly facing these existential threats,
Exactly.
So projecting strength and unity, I mean, it's got to be crucial.
Totally. But the downside is that it can create this situation where journalists feel pressured to put national interest over journalistic integrity.
Yeah, and she even mentions this study, Eldaz and Bartal, I think.
Right. Right.
That really digs into this phenomenon of self-censorship among journalists.
Oh, yeah. And it wasn't just about, outright censorship either, but this more subtle pressure to avoid certain narratives.
Yeah, like what? What were some of the reasons?
Well, they found that maintaining this national consensus, especially during times of conflict, was huge. There's this feeling that, a divided front just helps the enemy.
Well, so it's like, don't air your dirty laundry.
Exactly. And then you've got the whole impact on soldier morale.
Oh.
Imagine you're a journalist and you know that your words could undermine the fighting spirit of those on the front lines.
Yeah, that's a heavy weight.
Potentially putting lives at risk.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the fear of backlash. The study found that journalists who were seen as overly critical, especially early on in a conflict, they faced, harsh criticism, damage to their careers, even threats.
Wow. So you're really kind of stuck.
Exactly. So you see how this whole atmosphere of self-censorship gets created even without anyone directly telling them what to do.
Yeah, it's like this unspoken pressure.
Absolutely.
You start second-guessing yourself, even if you don't realize it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that pressure, I mean, it's got to be even more intense when you think about the fact that Israeli journalists, they don't have access to Gaza. So how do you report on something on something that you can't even see firsthand?
It's a huge, huge blind spot. I mean, ever since Israel withdrew from Gaza back in 2005, Israeli journalists have had very, very limited access.
Right.
So you've got this whole population, this whole other side of the conflict that's practically invisible in the Israeli media.
And even when they use international footage, like from Gaza, Tamir says it's presented differently, almost minimized.
It's the control isn't just about what they're saying, but it's also how it's shown.
Right.
Less airtime, tucked away in some corner of the screen. It all just kind of feeds into this idea that what's happening in Gaza is just less important.
Yeah, it's background noise almost. Which I thought it was really interesting that she highlighted these differences in how outlets like Haaretz and Now 14 are covering it, because they're coming from totally opposite ends of the political spectrum.
Completely.
But they're both showing these things that you wouldn't normally see in mainstream Israeli media.
Yeah, it's a really, really good example of how, even opposing ideologies can kind of expose the complexities of media coverage during a war. Haaretz, they're more left-leaning.
Right.
They've got a history of tackling these really thorny issues, the nuances of the conflict that a lot of the mainstream outlets just shy away from.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you've got Now 14, which is far right. And Tamir says they were surprisingly upfront about casualties in Gaza.
Yeah, and they had this, and I still can't get over this, a scoreboard on their website.
I know, right?
A scoreboard.
A scoreboard. I mean, it sounds awful, doesn't it?
It's kind of creepy.
Yeah, it's almost grotesque. But it's just such a stark example of framing because they're reducing human lives down to like numbers on a screen. It's like
Right.
they're gamifying
Counts.
the conflict. Every casualty is like a point, you know?
Yeah.
It's a measure of success.
It's really disturbing when you put it like that.
It is. And then you've got the language they use to talk about the casualties too. Like
Yeah.
Tamir pointed out that they were labeling all of the Gazan casualties as terrorists, no matter if they were civilians or actual combatants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So like just automatically everyone's a terrorist.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really dangerous, I think, because when you strip away the individual identities, right? When you reduce them to just this single label, it dehumanizes them, and it just makes it that much easier to justify what's being done.
Right. Like any and all casualties are like okay, they're terrorists.
Exactly. And that really connects back to that Michael Sward quote that Tamir uses. He said that Israeli television, it shapes consciousness not just by what it shows, but by what it hides.
Oh, yeah.
And when you combine that with this whole idea of labeling all the casualties as terrorists, you're basically erasing any chance for empathy. Any chance for understanding.
Yeah, it's like you're not even allowed to think about it.
Yeah. Right. You create this very black and white narrative, and any questioning of like the methods or any acknowledgement of the suffering on the other side, it's seen as weakness.
Wow.
Yeah, even treason.
So with all of that going on, it's kind of wild to me that Tamir found that Al Jazeera was like a top search term in Israel in 2023.
Really?
Yeah. So you're telling me that people are actively searching out these perspectives that totally challenge their own.
It suggests a certain level of curiosity, don't you think? I mean, even if you acknowledge that Al Jazeera has a pro-Palestinian bias, it's still a window into a narrative that you're just not going to find in Israeli media.
So it's like, yeah, they might have an agenda, but they're also seeing things that we're not.
Right. And that is such an important first step in developing media literacy. It's not about trusting any one source, but about, understanding their perspective and then actively trying to find different viewpoints.
So it's less about finding like the right answer and more about just acknowledging that there are multiple narratives, each with their own biases and everything.
Exactly. And that's especially important during these times of conflict because emotions are high and it's really easy to get swept up in everything.
Oh, yeah.
It's about taking a step back and asking, what am I not seeing and why?
It's almost like we're wired to just seek out the stuff that already makes sense to us.
Right.
Especially with something like as loaded as war.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like a defense mechanism. When the world fits our expectations, it feels safer.
Yeah.
But that also makes us really easy to manipulate.
Yeah. And that actually leads into, I think, was the most thought-provoking part of what Tamir was saying.
Okay.
Which is, she talks about how Israel, they want the world to see the full horror of what happened on October 7th.
Right.
Those Hamas attacks.
But those were horrific, and they've been very, very deliberate about it too, like showing that IDF film bearing witness to international media, even some members of their own parliament.
Wow.
It's like 37 minutes of raw footage from the attacks. It's really hard to watch.
Jimmy do.
Very graphic.
Intense. And was it effective though? I mean, what was the point?
It's meant to shock, to horrify.
Right.
And it does. I mean, she even mentions one soldier who said that they made his whole unit watch it right before they went into Gaza. Yeah.
I don't even know what to say to that.
It raises all sorts of questions about the psychological effects of that kind of selective exposure. Like on the one hand, they're trying to get their soldiers ready, right? Steal them for what they're going to see. But on the other hand, you're shielding them from the human cost of what they're about to do.
Right. And it's not just the soldiers either.
Right.
It makes me think about the families in Israel who are, waking up every day to the news of soldiers and hostages being killed, and it's just like this accepted part of life.
It's like there's this wall built around their grief. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This unspoken agreement that they'll only focus on their own losses without really dealing with the losses they're inflicting.
Right. Because to even go there is just like
too much. It's a coping mechanism, but it's a dangerous one. I mean, if you can dehumanize the other side that much, then anything you do is justified.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So we come back to this tension, right, that Tamir talks about between this desire for truth, for like real understanding, butting up against that very human need to just protect ourselves from stuff that's hard to deal with,
Absolutely.
especially when it challenges our identity, our beliefs.
Right. And that's the danger of just listening to stuff that we already agree with, you know?
Yeah.
That happens everywhere, not just in Israel.
Right.
We become blind to our own biases. We can't see the conflict clearly or the people stuck in the middle of it.
Right. It's all just noise.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? How do we actually get better at understanding these things, especially in a world where it feels like we're constantly being hit with all these different sides and narratives?
It starts with being aware, I think.
Yeah.
You know, just acknowledging that nobody has a monopoly on the truth.
Right.
It means actually looking for different perspectives, even the ones that make us uncomfortable, maybe especially those ones.
It's like that saying, right?
Yeah.
Don't believe everything you think.
Exactly. Question your sources, question yourself, and most importantly, you know, get comfortable with not knowing everything for sure. Because the truth is, with war, there are rarely any easy answers. It's messy, it's heartbreaking, and all we can do is keep asking these difficult questions, you know, and try to have empathy for everybody involved.
So the next time you find yourself getting pulled into a single story about a conflict, whether it's the Gaza war or something else entirely, take a second. Just pause and ask, what am I not seeing here? Whose voices are missing from this? And what uncomfortable truth might I be avoiding? It's in those moments, in that like willingness to be a little uncomfortable, that's how we start to see each other and the world